So what are the success stories then from this massive liberalization? Countries that liberalized before they developed, right? Not after.
Yeah. So some people look at the Asian tigers, for instance. So the Asian tigers, to be fair, had heavy state involvement in the economy, but when it comes to trade, it seemed like they were very outward facing. And they were sort of eager to get that investment. And it seems like today a lot of those
but that's different,
economies,
right? Those are two different things, Econoboi, no? Being trade outward facing, that's a different thing than being eager to get that foreign investment is I think what you're implying.
Sure. So when I say someone is sort of outward facing and looking for that foreign investment, to a certain extent, that's related to their trade liberalization. That's what I would say, right? But you're saying that indeed you can be outward facing in trade, but not necessarily care about foreign investment. Maybe explain the difference to me.
Yeah. So the thing is, okay, I think that we need to make a distinction between, do you need foreign investment for development? Then I think you need to make a distinction between, do you need foreign currencies? Because I think, in theory, every country can develop with their own investment through the banking system, creating credit and activating sort of capacity that's not being used. But of course, that's not the whole story, because you do typically need quite a bit of foreign currency to get started. If you want to build a chip industry, you're going to need to buy some machines, and they're not typically made in a developing country, right? And then there are a couple of ways to make that foreign currency, and I think the IMF has really been pushing since the 80s sort of the view that you need investment from abroad first, and then you can develop that, those industries. You can use that foreign currency to develop those industries. But the experience of the Asian tigers and also of Europe and also of Japan, for example, has very much been that they had this export-oriented growth model where they got foreign currencies by exporting first simple products. They started sort of low in the value chain and then moved up. And that's very different because it becomes a question of control then, right? Like, who controls your factories? Is it foreign investors, or is it, you earn it through exports mostly? Of course, this is never in extremes. And then you build those factories yourself, or more what I think was the most common approach very often also in China, like a cap on foreign ownership of 49%, for example, right?
That makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. So it sounds like from what you're saying, the Asian tigers development certainly was trade oriented to a certain extent, but it's more a question of how, what's the proportion of domestic investment to foreign investment, and indeed, if arguably, if a country has too much foreign investment, then a lot of that wealth might not be able to build and accumulate in the form of more robust capital and therefore more sort of profitable industries for the domestic country.
Yeah, exactly. And another argument that scholars have been sort of coming forward with now is that what they say is like foreign capital is very fickle, is what they call it, meaning that it's very likely to come in huge quantities, especially if there's like a quick buck to be made in the form of an asset boom, for example. And then it withdraws extremely quickly as well. So, you can see this, I think, compare it with sort of bank funding or something, where if a bank borrows very heavily from financial markets, it might become a bit more fragile than if it has a very solid depositor base. And I think for a country, you can look at it like that a little bit as well, that if they sort of try to get foreign currency through a solid export machine, that this is much more reliable than through foreign investment, which might sort of follow sort of asset booms and busts, and then just leave, and then you're in a currency crisis. And then just to get back to the IMF, you have to call in the IMF. And this is exactly what happened during the Asian financial crisis of 1997 for countries like Thailand and South Korea specifically. And there, I think they were both rescued by the IMF along with a couple of other countries, like the Philippines, for example. And there, I think you really see sort of where the IMF dogma went wrong, in the sense that in all of these countries, the IMF came in with its Washington consensus ideas. You need fiscal discipline. You need to quit sort of fuel subsidies and all of that, which I do think makes sense. But also, you have to have flexible exchange rates. You cannot undervalue it anymore. You have to have trade liberalization further. liberalization of investment, massive protection for foreign investors, all these state industries privatized, deregulation. And there, I think the view comes in like, maybe the IMF has been captured a little bit by the elite business or investor interest of Western investors. But also, sort of more from an economic perspective, like that's a blanket advice that some of it makes no macroeconomic sense. And some of it only makes sense for certain countries. Like, for example, at the time, South Korea was very developed already. So, okay, maybe some of those state enterprises had become a bit bloated. Some liberalization had to be made sense there. But for example, for a country like Thailand, that didn't make sense. And then they both got the same advice. And I think that's just, trying to get back a little bit to our IMF discussion. That's where I think a lot of the criticism also came from. So one, some of the policy advice is just horrible. And two, blanket advice doesn't work for every country. And typically it works better for countries that are already developed.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, this is where I think that Bosch and I, again, seemed to fundamentally agree with some of the problems of the IMF as an institution, where it does seem like the IMF has, at least historically, had some sort of a basket of policies that they would recommend to countries with some sort of deviation depending on the country. But it seems like broadly the IMF had a view that liberalization equals wealth, equals an ability to sustainably finance yourself, equals an ability to pay off your sort of IMF loan if you need one. And it seems like what you're saying, what I would agree with, and what perhaps the most modern economic thinkers might say is that this is not a one size fits all thing, and even liberalization in and of itself might not necessarily build the kind of sustainable wealth model that you'd want if you're a developing country. And it's interesting. I've never thought about the idea of arguably to a certain extent, foreign investor rights don't necessarily just mean you won't expropriate their capital, which is kind of how I viewed it, but it might also mean how much access you give foreign investors. Maybe you only give them 20% access to your markets, and maybe that 20% is super duper solid. Like, you're not going to just steal their 20%, but it might only be 20%. So that's maybe where the sort of capital controls come in to help domestically build wealth, which doesn't really jive with the IMF and sort of their view of development, at least their view of development for quite some time.
Yeah, exactly. And I think then also sort of one pain point that came in from all of this is that, for example, if we skip ahead in time a little bit and go to Greece, that not only did these policies sort of work very counterproductively, it was also that it was felt as being sort of implemented in a very humiliating way. So, for example, if you had Yanis Varoufakis, who used to be the Greek prime minister, he wrote this amazing book about sort of the political details and how the austerity measures were implemented there. And they had this thing called the Troika, which meant the ECB, European Commission, and IMF coming in to sort of tell the Greek people and government, like, hey, this is what you have to do. And he tells in very great detail sort of the arrogant and humiliating way that they go about it, which at one point, it doesn't completely make no sense, in the sense that the Greek government had screwed up to that point. But it is something, I think, which also adds to their impopularity. And also, he, for example, describes in great detail, like, the IMF people just came in airplanes, and then they got into their blinded cars and they drove to the ministry. They didn't even look around. They didn't see the protesters. They didn't sort of look at the situation. They just came in with their blanket orthodoxy. And I think that is it's not the main point I wanted to make, but it's definitely a part of the story that tells you why the IMF are so hated.